check. Good morning. So I have to tell you that I did buy the bulb to the projector. I did buy the bulb, and in fact, we installed it this morning, and it worked for about a minute and a half. And as I went in the little back room to get, just kind of go over my sermon a little bit, I thought to myself, we bought the bulb, we put it in, and it's working, and that's the weirdest thing for our church, because nothing ever works right away. Like, it takes forever for it to work. And then JoJo's up here talking about how it's not working, and of course, that's more in line with who we are as a church. Things are always broken, and they never work. Just like the people of God. So see, a pastor can turn anything into a sermon illustration, right? So if you're like a broken, dysfunctional person, you can always find a home here. Okay, all right, moving on. So we are moving into the Christmas season. Who's ready? Okay. Moving into the Christmas season, which means that this will be our last Sunday speaking on the Sermon on the Mount for now. We're always a stone throw away from the Sermon on the Mount. But we're moving into a new series next week surrounded, about Christmas and all that good stuff. But if I could summarize, or as we wrap up this message on the Sermon on the Mount, if I could summarize this sermon from Jesus, just a couple bullet points. When Jesus gives a Sermon on the Mount, he's talking about an internal transformation over external compliance. In other words, to know Jesus is to have a transformed heart, not necessarily moralism or behavior or rules, right? The second thing that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount is radical love and forgiveness. He talks about humility and selflessness. He talks about a pursuit of justice and mercy. He talks about making peace and elevating those in the margins. And these teachings, of course, push against our natural desires. And in fact, they are very unpopular, even in our current society and current context, especially among Christians. I read this article in Christianity Today recently, and it spoke about several pastors around the country getting pushback from their congregations, from their churches, for some of their talking points, some of their sermons. And these pastors were reminding people, because people were saying, hey, where are you getting these talking points? Things that you are talking about are un-American, or they're compromising, or they're dangerous. And people would remind their churches that they were literally quoting Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount. And rather than people saying, oh my goodness, I had no idea. I have to change my mind and conform the way that I'm thinking to be in line with Jesus. That's not what they said. People would say, okay, well, then Jesus was wrong. And we must change the way we're talking about Jesus, because what Jesus is saying, it gives away too much. It's too weak. It's wrong. It doesn't work in this world. So what we have done is develop this idea in our tribe as followers of Jesus that we can take Jesus as a conquering champion, right? That's the Jesus that we like. It's the Jesus who's risen from the dead. He beats everything and conquers everything, and in him we can beat and conquer. Like we want Jesus as a conquering champion. But what we don't want is this Jesus who teaches about love and reconciliation. We don't want this Jesus who is nonviolent. We don't want this Jesus who promotes advocacy for the poor and for making peace. Like we don't want that. Because in our context, we believe that's a threat to our culture or our way of life or our rights or our privileges. We think it's a threat. We don't want it. So can we have Jesus the way we choose him? Right? Can we pick and choose the Jesus that we want? Can we have a Jesus that suits our needs, but also a Jesus that we can ignore when he teaches us things or encourages us things to do things that make us uncomfortable or oppress us? When Jesus concludes this Sermon on the Mount, he speaks to this. He speaks directly to this dilemma. Because there are absolutely people hearing him when he spoke these truths, wondering, do we have to do all of these things? Do we have to do what Jesus asked? Because if we do these things, it's gonna force us to change in really big ways. Do we have to do this? Here's what Jesus says. Therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down and the streams rose and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came, the stream rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a giant crash. Now again, Jesus has just given this sermon, this incredible, revolutionary sermon. A sermon that we often summarize as the upside-down ethic or the upside-down kingdom. It changes everything about the way we see the world. And people were absolutely wondering, do we have to follow it? Do we have to take all of these things because it seems really, really hard? So Jesus tells them directly, they have two options. Number one, you can follow my words, hear them, and put them into practice, or you can ignore them. But your future and your livelihood and discovering your purpose and identity as a human rests on your choice. Your livelihood and flourishing as a human depends on whether or not you follow what I'm teaching. And this applied to the original hearers, and it applies to us today as well. Now I want to break these verses down, and as we're going to do this, we're going to encounter one of the really cool things about the Bible, that it uses several literary forms at one time, or rather, it uses several literary forms to communicate, and sometimes it can use more than one at the same time. So as we tell this story, Jesus is going to be speaking to us metaphorically, but also historically, and we're going to try to unpack both of these this morning because I think it makes the passage come alive in new ways. And I'm going to work hard to keep this from being confusing. And if you have the Bible app, did you guys get the text message this morning with the link to the Bible app? So this is why we ask you to check in, by the way, because I'm only sending these text messages to people who've checked in, right? So if you've checked in, you're getting a link to the Bible app. And in the Bible app, I'm spelling out what's metaphor and what's historical so you can kind of follow along. It might help this come alive for you a little bit, might help out. But as we read this, starting at verse 24, it says, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And Jesus is contrasting this to verse 26, but everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who has built his house on sand. So Jesus is drawing a comparison between building techniques. And I remember when I heard this passage as a small child, I couldn't visualize a house being built on a rock. It didn't really make any sense to me because sand always seems to be more cooperative. And as a little boy, I remember building sandcastles, right, and digging in the soil. So sand and soil seem more cooperative. You can dig in sand or soil, and it just seems easier, like if you were thinking about putting up a bunch of houses, and everyone has seen a new development go in, maybe near your home, or you've driven by it, and it's just easier to put up a new development or build a highway or city to just move things out of the way. You don't build on rocks. You use dynamite and explosives and excavators to move the rocks. You don't build on rocks because it's cheaper to move them or cut through them. It's more efficient, it's quicker, it's more cost-effective to move rock than build on rock. It's more cost-effective, which is why your house won't be standing 150 years from now. It just won't. Unless your ancestors and the people who buy it want to keep that house and refit it and put structures in it, they're going to make it last forever. Your house will not be there. It's not intended to be. It won't be there. Because the rain came down and the stream rose and the winds blew and beat against that house and it fell with a great crash. It may happen all at once, or it may take 100 years, but that house is coming down. It's not going to last. But if you take the time and expend the resources to build a house on rock, that house is going to stand tall for 1,000 years. 2,000 years, 3,000 years. You can see houses and structures that are that old and older. It happens all the time. Because the rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. It takes more time and more resources and more work, but those structures that are built on rock, they're not going anywhere. So as we try to make sense of this, we see inside this parable that there are two variables and one constant. The variable is how you build. Rock or sand. That's the variable. The constant is what? The storm. The storm is always going to come. And if you've been around a minute, if you're older than 2 years old, you know what that looks like. The storm always comes. How you endure the storm depends on how you build. If you build a structure on stone or in stone, the strength is in the rock. And this is what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, I am the rock. And this is the metaphor here. The Bible is constantly referring to God as a rock. And Jesus is doing the same thing here. And if you build a structure on stone or in stone, the strength is in the rock, not the house. The house takes its strength from the rock. But if you build a house on soil, there's no strength in the sand or the soil. So the house needs to have all the strength. You're building in the sand? Okay. You better have a real strong house. And that's what we might say. You might say, I don't need Jesus. I don't need faith. I don't need God as my foundation because I'm going to build a strong house. I'm going to build a life with strong structures that are going to hold up. But what we know, and you know if you've been around for a minute, is that we are always trying to build this structure that gives us identity and meaning, and we're always trying to build it from our idols and desires. Wealth, power, education, family, career, reputation, and none of those things are going to hold up because you're going to get sick, and you're going to get old, and you're going to be broke, and you're going to be let down and betrayed, and you'll become irrelevant, or someone with more talent will come along. See, your house is never going to hold up to the storm. It never will. It never will. So Jesus is saying, you can put your hope in this rock or in that little house that you're trying to build. But this rock is going to stand from age to age. For who is God beside the Lord? And who is the rock except your God? The rock of your salvation, the fortress who will never be shaken. But that little house that you're trying to build is going to fall. It's going to crumble. It's going to turn to dust. So you get to choose. You get to choose how you want to build. Now this is clearly metaphor, right? Jesus is teaching us in metaphor. He's speaking about spiritual truths, and it seems pretty straightforward. You could teach the same lesson in these classrooms, and these children would very easily understand. But Jesus is also speaking to a group of people who know their scriptures really, really well. And they know in their scriptures there are multiple illustrations or allusions, specifically in the book of Isaiah, about the temple in Jerusalem being this house built on a rock or mountain. And this is from Isaiah chapter 2. Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of God, the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So as they're hearing this, these words from Jesus, this parable from Jesus, in the back of their minds is also this teaching from Isaiah that refers to the temple in Jerusalem as this rock on a mountain. So in this historical moment, as Jesus is teaching this parable, what he's conveying or trying to teach them is that the house on solid rock is not a physical structure. It's not that building in Jerusalem. That's not what it is. It's him. It's his teachings, his ethic, the power that comes through him. Again, he's saying, the embodiment of my teachings are within you. It's my presence in you. That is the house on the rock. But again, these people are standing in the shadow of this massive temple. And it's being renovated by King Herod, and it's beautiful, and it's imposing, and it's incredible. And people come from all over the world to see this building. It's the center of their spiritual and social and ethnic and cultural identity. So it would be very easy for them to hear these teachings from Jesus, hear this parable, and connect Jesus to that structure over there in Jerusalem. But if they do that, they're going to hear Jesus' words and come away very confused. Because, just to make this clear, he's trying to teach them that they can experience a new and revolutionary life that brings God to the people. God coming to the people. God coming out of heaven to the people, to all people, and giving them grace, compassion, and love. He's trying to teach them that God is reaching into history and that he is the rock and foundation. But what they're hearing is as they live under the domination of temple life, is that Jesus is just giving some new spin on some old spirituality. That Jesus is just teaching it a new way, and that structure back in Jerusalem is still the central focus of the faith. So what they're hearing is that rather than Jesus bringing God to the people, they would assume that nothing has changed, and he's just trying to bring people back to the temple. And this is a terrible misunderstanding. It's a terrible misunderstanding. But we have no room for judgment because we do this all the time. We do this all the time. We misunderstand or misuse Jesus all the time. We talked about this last week. So it's really not a surprise that people wouldn't take the Sermon on the Mount seriously in our own context. Because what we want is familiar structures. We want something easy and familiar, something that we have grown accustomed to, rather than rebuilding our identity and foundation around Jesus. It's way easier to assume that Jesus was speaking about the temple, something I'm already familiar with, than actually hearing him, because if he's telling us something new, if he's telling me something new, if he's introducing something revolutionary, if he's changing the way I see God and changing the way I see people, that means I have to change. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to change. So when we hear Jesus teach this ethic from the Sermon on the Mount, grace over change, radical love and forgiveness, humility and selflessness, pursuing justice and mercy, making peace and elevating those in the margins, it's way easier to see those as just mere suggestions. It's way easier to ignore the hard parts of those teachings and just embrace the parts I like about him. It's way easier just to add the parts I like about Jesus to the systems and structures that I'm used to. Just easier to add him. Just mix them in. Because I like to be comfortable. And transforming our lives is very, very difficult. Adding elements of Jesus to our existing structures is far easier. And I'm going to give you some examples of what this looks like in our present culture, because we do it in at least 4 ways. I'm going to tell you what they are. The first one is moralism. Jesus becomes a tool for behavior modification, right? I see people in the world that I disagree with, and I don't like what they do. Right? So what I tell them is that God doesn't want anything to do with them unless they change the way they behave, right? Because the key to Jesus is behavior modification, right? And who becomes the judge on what good behavior is and what's good enough for God? We do. So we project our own insecurity, we project our own dissatisfaction, we project our own guilt and shame onto other people, and we condemn them because it makes us feel better about who we are. That's moralism. This is a structure that we create that is, make no mistake, anti-Christ. The second is Christian nationalism or political idolatry. This is an American thing, but it's a historical thing that has gone on for 2,000 years. And we make the gospel uniquely ours. In our case, it's uniquely American because we are better and we are more blessed and we are uniquely chosen and we are God's favored. And this always, every time you see it in the history of the world, elevates one ethnic group to be supreme over others. Do you hear me? If you think this doesn't exist, you're wrong. And then what we do is in this nationalism, we choose partisan groups that represent this national identity, and we think they're doing the work of God. That they're chosen by God to enact God's policies. That is Antichrist. And I'm going to tell you something. You see this showing its face throughout our history, throughout human history, and every time you see this, people die. Do you hear me? People die. It is Antichrist. Number 3 is justice without love. We want to heal the injustices of the world without loving the opposition, right? So we see something that is wrong, like poverty, or any of the isms, okay? And we want to defeat this thing at any cost. So we'll make war to get peace. Now, injustice should be battled. It should be. But not at any cost. This has seeds of Christ, but is Antichrist. And then advocacy without grace. And here, this is where we want to stick up for the little guy, right? We want to protect the broken. But in our desire to protect, in our desire to heal and advocate, we cannot forgive or include outsiders who've caused harm. Grace doesn't exist in this system. And that's a problem. Because peace is not peace, or shalom is not shalom, unless we all have shalom. And of course, in the gospel, Jesus is including his enemies, which are who? Raise your hand. Do it. Go ahead. It's okay. You'll be fine. Come on. Let's just put them up. Let's come. Ray Strimple is looking at me like, preacher, don't you tell me what to do. Don't tell me what to do, preacher. I'm a preacher too. All right, Ray, I'll give you a pass, brother. I love you. Let's get breakfast next week, and we'll talk more about this. We can't, on one hand, advocate and refuse to give grace. It's Antichrist. All of these structures that we have developed to combat some fear or problem that we see in the world. We create these structures because we see something wrong and we want a sense of spirituality around them. But they're imperfect and they're not representing Jesus. And of course we believe that Jesus supports them. Of course we believe that Jesus is associated with them, and we will interpret the Bible through the lens of these structures. Of course Jesus is behind moralism. Of course Jesus is behind Christian nationalism. Of course Jesus supports justice without love. Of course Jesus agrees that advocacy doesn't always need grace. And the more I believe he's behind these things, the more spiritual and noble and divine my cause is. And when you disagree with me, then I become a persecuted prophet. Just like Jesus was, right? And your disagreeing with me proves I'm spiritual and you're evil and wrong. Jesus was never going to be found in our structures. Never. Not in the temple in Jerusalem, and not in these ideological structures that all people groups have always created and attached his name to. Nazism, the slave trade, the oppression of women, the slaughter of native people, the outbreak of wars. They've always associated God with these evil movements. Jesus doesn't need our structures. He cannot be found in them. He's too different. He's too revolutionary. And our structures do not work. So he created his own. Jesus doesn't move towards our structures. We move into his. But he tells us what's going to happen with all of our structures. Then, as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones, he said, "These things which you see The days will come in which not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. And Jesus is saying that this temple, this beautiful temple, is going to be destroyed. And that's what happens in 70 AD. The temple in Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans. Not one stone is left on another. And here's the irony of this. As I'm talking about the temple in Jerusalem, there may be some of you who don't know what I'm referring to, okay? Do you know that the Romans, they destroyed this temple, but before they destroyed the temple, they went inside of it, and they took all the valuables, the gold, the jewels, and do you know what they did with it? Took it back to Rome, and they built their own structure. Do you know what structure they built with the loot from the temple? The Colosseum. You heard of that one? You seen that one? You seen that one? Uh-huh. So here's what's happening. This structure of religion is torn down, and the world takes it, and they build their own structure. So what Jesus is saying is this temple isn't as strong as you think. It's built on sand. It's built on inequity and injustice and empty spirituality. And likewise, all the structures we create will meet the same fate because they are built on our own desire. And in the end, it's just sand. You know what's different about the structure that Jesus builds? I just went away for the train. What's different about Jesus' structure? Why is it different from the ones that we create? Jesus' structure, the foundation of his teachings and his ethical presence, is other people. The focus on the ministry of Jesus, the concern that brought him from heaven to earth, is other people. When you read the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 through 7, if you read this trying to find some solution or formula for how to get wealthy, how to get all the stuff you want, how to gain power, you ain't going to find it. Because it's about the other. In Jesus' structure he creates, the focus is on serving the needs of others so that I can experience joy as a byproduct of my love and service. In the structures that we create, the focus is about serving my own needs so that I can experience power. So if your foundation is on loving and serving others, nothing that happens in the world around you, not poverty or empires or tragedy or the wind or the rain or floods, can shake your purpose or identity. Because I know my focus is you and you and you and you. That's my focus. It's on serving and loving you. What happens out here, that's not going to change anything for me. Because my focus was always you. But if your foundation is on building up or serving yourself or your narrow view of the world, literally anything can break you down. Disapproval of others, not getting your own way, failures, unmet expectations, anything can break you down. So our endurance and perseverance must be built from the ground up by him and through him. And this is always going to be through a life of love and serving others. But it starts in him from the bottom up. And this is a good test. All the systems that you put in your life where you try to find spirituality, is it built from the bottom up through him? Does it look like him through every lens? I think it's worth mentioning that the Apostle Paul, no doubt inspired by Jesus' words, gives a similar analogy. A similar analogy to Jesus' wise and foolish builders. He's writing a letter to a church he started in Ephesus. And Ephesus is in Turkey. And this is decades after Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And Paul's audience in Ephesus was very diverse. And let's break these into two groups. You have Gentiles and Jewish people, right? Anybody who is not Jewish is a Gentile, right? So you've got these two groups of people, and they didn't know how to interact. They didn't know how to cohabitate in the same faith system. Both wanted to know Jesus, but it felt like their differences were too great. But these people in Ephesus were also living in the shadow of a huge temple, massive structure, to a god called Artemis. So knowing this division of people, knowing they weren't living out this Sermon of the Mount ethic and unity and loving one another, and knowing their context, their environment, here's what he writes. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household. You are not two groups of people, you are one family. It doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter what you used to do or who your parents were. It doesn't matter what social status you are in. It doesn't matter your economic status. You're one family. You're one group of people. Earlier, Paul says that God has torn down, Jesus has torn down the dividing wall of hostility, making all people into one humanity. You're members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. Okay, so Paul is using his own building analogy, okay? But here, he's saying that the structure has the foundation in the leaders and fellow servants of Jesus and the Word of God. But where is Jesus? We should read this word as keystone. Paul wants us to read this as keystone or capstone. What does a keystone do? It holds an arch together. Holds an arch together. And why is he using the arch as a metaphor for a building? Because this is how the Greek people made their structures. And arches, as these Greek people are hearing the words of Paul, they're reading them, they see arches everywhere. So Paul is creating a new analogy so they see where the strength is at. And Jesus, as the keystone, is holding everything together. He's at the top of the structure, holding it all together. And in him, the whole building is joined together. and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him, you too are being built together to become a dwelling place in which God lives by his Spirit. When Jesus tells the story, he's the foundation at the bottom. But when Paul tells the story, Jesus is the keystone at the top. So it's not just Jesus at the bottom, it's Jesus at the top. From the top to the bottom, and we are the stones. And together, together, we are being built into what? What are we being built into? Begins with a T. A temple. We're being built into a temple, which is the dwelling place of God. It's not back in Jerusalem, and it's not the temple of Artemis. It's the people moving out into the world to do the work of God, the work of love, and the work of justice, and the work of peace. Now there's a little more, and I'm going to say this in a different way so you get the next part. Jesus is the rock at the bottom, and he's the rock on top that holds everything together. And in between those stones or those rocks are us, rising into the air. Rock on the bottom, rock at the top, rock in the middle, rising up. And what do we call a towering, rising formation of rock? We call it a mountain. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains, and it will be exalted above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. All the nations, all the people. We are the temple. And the temple is a mountain that reveals the power and the majesty of the one who has created it. This is what we become in Christ. And this is what it looks like when we are living his ethic of love and seeking to change the world through justice and peace. We become something together that is irresistible and beautiful and restorative. And there is nothing more relevant, there's nothing more powerful, there's nothing more transformative, and this is what we could be. This is what we could be. A temple where God lives and dwells, a mountain that is the source of God's power and goodness. In Jesus, he lets us choose. Who do you want to be? My prayer for us is that we reject our own structures, put away our own desires, and choose Jesus. Always, only Jesus. Always, only Jesus.
Christ is my firm foundation, the rock on which I stand when everything around me is shaking.